Hey guys, happy Sunday. Like Andy said, my name is Andrew. I am the second tier Andrew. He's Andy Tier, you get it, joke. I'm a really funny guy, if you didn't know, so if you didn't get me a birthday gift, laugh at my joke. Logan, talking to you. All right, so this weekend, we are wrapping up our series, Slow Your Roll, where we've been looking for the last 8 weeks at the different roles in the family. Things like fathers and mothers, things like husbands and wives, siblings, grandparents, and I'm forgetting some children, maybe. Was that the one I forgot? And all along, we've been planning to kind of land the plane by talking about something a lot of people have asked. The question, like, what if I'm single? Like, what does all this have to do with me if I'm single? Good news, Phil thought ahead, and we are talking about singleness today. So we are going to wrap things up by looking at how Scripture speaks about singleness. And as we do, we are going to be in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. That's where we are going to spend our time today. And as you do, I just want to set up a couple of things here. First, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul simply describes singleness as the state of being unmarried. So if you're here today, you find yourself unmarried, you fall into Paul's category of singleness. And it's important for us to think well about this for a variety of reasons. And those reasons have to do with where different people in this room find themselves in life. There are people in this room who have never been married, some of which are really content with that, some of which wish that wasn't the case, and that's a reality that we face. We have some people in here that have same-sex attraction and yet have chosen to walk faithfully with the Lord as a celibate single, and that's a challenging place to be. We have people here who are single because they've lost a spouse and they've walked through the grief of losing a spouse. We have people in this room who have a spouse who maybe doesn't share their beliefs or doesn't attend with them, and they feel alone. They feel lonely at times, that they feel like they may fit in this category as well. We have people in this room who are single now because someone else chose to leave a marriage and walk out on the vows that had been made there. We also have people in this room who have chosen to leave a marriage, and that's why they find themselves single. And I've been accused of being morbid every now and then, and I guess my mind does go to weird places sometimes. But the things I realized this week is that for those of us who are married, about 50% of us will find ourselves single again because our spouse will die before we do. That's kind of morbid, but I think is a sobering reality for us to face. That singleness isn't just maybe this thing that happened once upon a time in our life, but it's something that our Christian brothers and sisters, many are in right now, and some of us will be again. And so it's important for us to think well about singleness and think well about God's design for singleness, not someday in the future, but right now, so that we can walk faithfully in God's design. And as we approach this topic of singleness, I want to recognize up front that this is a very tender topic for many in this room. It can stir up lots of emotions, of hopes and dreams and desires for good things like family and companionship. It can bring up disappointment, heartbreak, grief, and confusion about why hopes and desires have been left unfulfilled or why dreams have been shattered. There's no pretending that there's some like simplistic, clear-cut answer that's going to make everyone in this room feel better. And yet I believe that God has a good word for us to hear as we jump into this passage today. Before we get there, it's important for us to maybe think about some of the tensions that exist in our lives and in our world whenever it comes to singleness. One of those is the reality that in many ways, singleness in our culture is more highly thought of now than ever before. What I mean by that is many people in our culture are delaying marriage or foregoing marriage altogether because of the recognized freedom and independence that comes with being single. In light of this reality, people think that it's really hard to maybe give up the freedom that they have socially, the freedom that they have financially, to not share that with someone else, or whatever other freedom they have in our culture. That's a challenging thing to give up. At the same time, the church more generally has not followed this direction. Many singles I've talked to talked about how they feel the implicit and sometimes very explicit assumption that not only should they be married, but the longer they go without being married, the more people around them seem to assume there's something wrong with them. This comes through in the not so subtle question about who they're dating or why they aren't dating someone else, or it's not always verbalized, but what they often receive is the idea that, like, what's wrong with you? You're still single? What's going on? What's going on with you? And this is a challenging thing that shouldn't be the case in the church, and yet it's something that is often communicated by our maybe sometimes well-intentioned, maybe sometimes just curiosity that we express in asking questions. And yet, as we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we actually see that Paul challenges both of these paradigms. You see, in our broader culture, while singleness may be more highly thought of than ever before, God's design for singleness includes celibacy, to refrain from what Paul describes as porneia, which is any sexual activity outside of God's design for marriage between one man and one woman. So anything outside of this is something described as sexual immorality. And Paul says that we are to flee this, that singleness is to not include this type of expression, which is a challenge in our culture. See, it's a challenge in our culture because we live in a time where, while, again, this is held in high regard, the idea of refraining from sexual activity or refraining from sexual expression is seen as stifling, if not impossible. In fact, it's not only seen as stifling, it can be seen as suppressing someone's very identity, suppressing the very core of who someone is. So we're going to see today in this passage that God invites us into something that's a little bit different. And it all comes out of a foundation that Paul lays at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 6. The last couple sentences at the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 6, here's what Paul writes, starting in verse 19. He says, "You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." It's a different starting point for our identity. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 7 gives us a little bit of a map to what to do with this tension that we may be feeling. 1 Corinthians 7 is the response to a question that was asked about a letter that Paul had written to the Corinthians. So Paul writes them a letter. They have a question. This letter here involves a lot of Paul's response to that letter. And what we see here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is that one of the questions that the church was asking, one of the assumptions that they had made based upon what they heard from Paul, was that it was better for people to abstain from sex no matter what. So married or unmarried, whatever, abstain was the thing that they were hearing. And what Paul says in this chapter is that's not exactly the case. And what he does is he actually affirms this view of singleness while challenging the premise. As he works through here, he talks about those that are married, like you have an obligation to engage in sex with your partner. That shouldn't be abused, that whole thing, but it's part of God's design for marriage. He then goes on to talk about those who are married to believers, those who are married to unbelievers. He talks for a minute about those who've previously been married. And all of this in the first 16 verses leads up to a more general principle that Paul gives us for how we should think about singleness. How is it that we should think about not even just singleness, but also marriage? Let's pick things up in verse 17, where Paul writes this. He says, nevertheless, that nevertheless is referring to whether one is a widow, widower, single, married to a believer, non-believer. Nevertheless, wherever you find yourself, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He should not become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He should not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's command is what counts. Each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who is free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in whatever situation they were in when God called them. Here Paul writes to the Corinthians, and it seems like the church at Corinth was exploring a certain belief sort of approach. The belief they were exploring was the idea that if they really wanted to be spiritual, or if they really wanted to experience deeper levels of spirituality with God, then they should change their relational status. So those that were married were being tempted to leave marriages. Those who were single were asking the question, should I get married? And to all of these different people, what Paul's basic principle is, stay where you were when you were called. Stay where you were whenever God called you, whenever he welcomed you in to his family. His point is that a change in relational status does not improve your spiritual standing or your spiritual status. And to highlight this, what Paul does is he uses two images that the people would have been really familiar with. The first is circumcision. Really quick, what happened in the early church was that a lot of the people who were Jews before they came to faith in Jesus believed that if someone was to come to faith from a Gentile background, a non-Jew background, they had to be circumcised in order to gain a higher level of spiritual status. And what Paul is saying here is that's not the case. Stay as you were when you were called. Trust that God, whenever he bought you with the blood of Jesus, that was enough, that you don't have to change your status in order to have a better standing with him. He makes this point 3 times there in verse 17, verse 20, and then 24. A second image he uses is one that may be pretty troubling to us. It's the idea of being a slave or free. And in that passage, what Paul is writing about is the reality that if someone finds themselves in slavery, they don't need to seek a way out of that in order to gain a greater status with God. Now, hearing Paul talk about slavery in this way may be something that's uncomfortable for us because here in the United States, we often have in mind the slavery of the American South and the injustice and the disgusting things that took place in that setting. One thing to recognize in the first century is just how pervasive slavery was. It's not justifying it, but it was something that was across all sort of populations. It was something that existed, and it wasn't seen by everyone as being as oppressive as it has been in other generations. This is in large part because in the first century, someone who was considered a slave could be highly educated and could actually be entrusted with running someone's entire household in a very real and meaningful way. They could gain their own wealth. There were ways in which it operated as just part of the economic system, and for some people, it was more like a job for them. It was a state that they found themselves in, and so Paul is saying that, hey, if you come to Christ, it's not that you have to flee from this in order to have a greater spiritual status. Instead, he says that you can stay where you are. Now, he also offers that caveat there, right? But if you have the opportunity to be free, right? Seek that. That's okay. That doesn't mean you stay where you are forever, but it does mean that you don't have to seek a way out of your current situation in order to experience deeper levels of experience of who God is and who God made us to be. I think this is an important message for us to hear as a church body. Stay faithful in the status you had whenever you came into God's family, and trust that as God's kingdom breaks into your life, breaks into your community, breaks into our broader world, that God will bring about change in different situations in your life, but you can trust him to be the one to bring about that change. You don't have to muster it up in your own power to bring about that kind of change. You can trust God with that. So if you're single, you don't have to seek marriage to improve your spiritual status or to be more effective in ministering for God. Additionally, recognize that those in this room who are not married, again, married people, they are not benefiting from your question about their dating life all the time. That's not the most helpful thing for you to do as you are engaging with someone who is single, because what it can start to plant in their heart is that there is something they're missing out on. What they're experiencing is less than God's best because they're not married yet. They're not experiencing human life to its fullness because they find themselves single. And Paul's words here is that's silly. In fact, what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7, just a little bit earlier in here, speaks to this point. Paul writes to this church, and one of his starting statements is this: I wish that all of you were as I am. What's Paul talking about? He's talking about being single. He says, but each one of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, and another has that. So there's a way in which Paul sees singleness as a gift from God to be used for the benefit of others in the advancement of his kingdom. And he's going to get into why it is that we could possibly consider singleness a gift in the verses ahead. Let's pick things up in verse 25. He says, now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord, but I give you a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Do not seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Do not look for a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. But those who marry will face troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. Here, what Paul is doing is he's building upon what he's just written in verses 17 through 24, making the point again, you don't have to change your relational status. And Paul says, especially in light of the present crisis. Now, we don't know exactly what that present crisis was in Corinth. Was it political turmoil? Was it sickness that was going around? Was it something going on economically? We don't know exactly what it is that's happening, but we do know Paul's point here, that whenever you are single, things are simpler. This is just a state of fact, that life as a single is simpler than when you are married. And if you're married here and you don't think that that's true, you may be kind of fooling yourself. Just think back, okay? I had the thought today about, okay, what did that actually look like in my own life? And the illustration I like to use probably more than I should was whenever I first got married, probably the first 3 months or so, I ate dinner twice, probably 10 or 15 times. Why? Because I didn't remember I was supposed to think about someone else before eating a meal. It's a lot simpler to just eat when you want to and not think about anyone else, right? And that is a silly, simple example that you can then play out over any number of decisions you're making in your life. Before I got married, I decided I was going to go to Costa Rica for 7 months and work with some missionaries there. And guess what? I was even dating Bree, and I probably should have given her more of a voice, but I didn't give her much of a voice into that. I was going to Costa Rica. I was single. I had that freedom to explore that. Things were simpler. Now, whenever we say that things are simpler, that doesn't mean that things were easier. It doesn't mean that things are easy to just do, but what Paul seems to be saying is this simpler life is something to take advantage of. So if you're in this room and you're in that place right now, take advantage of this season. Take advantage of opportunities to grow in giftedness that God has given you, to grow in interest, to grow in the career that God has given you. Take advantage of these opportunities to seek the development of the gifts God has given you for the sake of others. This is always God's design for us with the gifts he's given us, to use them for the advancement of his kingdom and the building up of his church. So take advantage of the simplicity for that purpose. Take advantages of the opportunities you have to serve in our community, maybe within the church, maybe in the nations, in ways that you may not get to later on in life. Take advantage of the opportunities that are present. Take advantage of the opportunity to even experience more wholeness in your own life. Maybe there are some wounds that you've experienced in your life, and now is an opportunity for you to experience healing there through counseling or through freedom prayer or through the mentorship and discipleship of someone else. Take advantage of the simplicity that you have in your life right now for these purposes. While life is simpler and marriage is good, Paul recognizes both of these things are true. And Paul's point here is that while marriage is not a sin, it does make life more complex, which he goes on to expand on in these next several verses. Verse 29, what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it were not theirs to keep, those who use the things of this world as if not engrossed in them. For this world in its present form is passing away. You see, this simpler life Paul is calling us for, we'll see here in the coming verses, is also about this undivided attention that we can have. But here in verses 29 through 31, his point is that the time is short. The world is passing away. So Paul's encouragement to both singles and to married people is to not hold on to the things that you have in your life that oftentimes bring security. Things like family, things like finances, things like husband and wife or possessions, whatever it may be. Don't cling to these things as security, but live in light of what's true in the future. That this world is passing away, so shift that security you have there to the Lord. Make sure you're clinging to the right thing. See, oftentimes people will pursue marriage out of the thought that this will bring about security for something that's going on in their life. And Paul is simply pointing to the reality that we shouldn't marry out of this kind of desperation. Instead, we should keep a posture both with our possessions and with our relationships in an eternal perspective. Not abandoning them, but also not looking to them for security. Paul goes on in verse 32 to write this: I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord, both in body and spirit. But a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I am saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way, in undivided devotion to the Lord. See, what Paul is highlighting here is an expansion on the idea of life being simpler. It's the idea that as a single, you can have a greater level of single-mindedness, focused on the things of God than you can when you're married. The reality is that if someone were to come up to me right now and say, hey, Andrew, do you want to go to China tomorrow to go on a mission trip? I've got 2 kids and a wife to think about, and I have to think about how that decision impacts them. So I have to think about the affairs of this world, to use Paul's language. If you're someone who's here today and you're like, that's not true of me, I don't have to think about that stuff. I'm married and I just think about the Lord's affairs. Check in with your spouse and see how that's going, okay? You may be failing to do what God has called you to do as a spouse or as a parent because you've dismissed that responsibility for something else. Paul's point here isn't that marriage is bad or that you shouldn't pursue it or that it's not something that you can experience in richness. His point is that it does require your attention to be focused on people here and the Lord. Whereas when you're single, you can ask the question like, okay, Lord, what do you want to do? And you don't really have to ask the question of, does this require a conversation with my spouse? Okay, yeah, godly counsel, that stuff's great, but it's not like it's you and someone else making that decision together. There's a greater level of freedom in singleness for serving the Lord and his design for you. See, this passage here is incredibly rich, and there's so much more here. But something I want to just highlight, this comes from scholar Richard Hayes as he writes this. And this is something I want to make sure we hear. He says, one of the most important messages of this text for the church is that the single life has dignity and value before God. As we read what Paul wrote, there are many questions that might arise. Many questions about what this looks like practically, but we can't skip over this point. And if you're here today and you are single for whatever reason, I want you to know that you have immense dignity and value before God, not despite your singleness, but in many ways because of it. God sees you. God is with you. God desires to draw you in. And yet that doesn't mean that it's easy. It doesn't mean it's simple. So in our remaining time together, I want to think about that. Why is it not easy, and how can we maybe better think about singleness? I want to talk about 3 challenges that are present. The first is this, the challenge of living with sexual integrity. You see, you and I live in a world that insinuates and often explicitly states that wholeness is possible only with the free sexual expression of whatever our identity is whenever it comes to sexuality. It's only when we freely express that we can experience wholeness as human beings. And we live in such a world, and so you and I can begin to buy into this lie as well. Well, let's think about living with sexual integrity as a single. What does that look like? Well, it means that living with this lie all around us can often make us feel like fleeing from sexual immorality is just too much. We can't do it. It's too weighty. It's not something that we can really handle, and it begins to leads to us feeling overwhelmed. Tim Keller offered a helpful illustration that I just want to share with you about maybe how to flip the paradigm for how we're thinking about this. He talked about the question, like, have you ever had a time in your life where you had a really deep hunger or desire for food in some way? Maybe it was a certain kind of food or whatever it may be, but every single time you went somewhere to have that desire satisfied, the place was closed. As you went to one place, you started to get frustrated. You went to the next place, you became more frustrated. You went to the next place, and that frustration just started bubbling over, and you found yourself angry and irritable because you can't satisfy this deep longing and desire that you have to have that desire for food satisfied. It can be overwhelming. Again, it can lead to this idea of irritability. And I think a lot of times, whenever we try to follow a Christian sexual ethic in light of this lie around us in the world that wholeness is only found through sexual expression, the temptation can become all-consuming whenever we feel like that desire's not satisfied. But what if we reframe this analogy to thinking about when you're on a diet? Whenever you're on a diet, you walk past the donut bank donuts, and instead of thinking, I'm missing out, you think, I am saying no for a greater purpose. I am saying no to this desire I have in front of me because this greater purpose is me becoming a better version of myself or whatever it may be. You're trusting that saying no to that thing that looks really, really good, that you really, really want to grab, is saying yes to something better. What if we view that with this idea of living with sexual integrity? Whenever we walk through this world and we have these desires that we have that we're saying no to, we're not saying no just because we're missing out or God's trying to stifle our fun, but instead we're saying no to those desires because we're saying yes to God transforming us into a greater person that He's created us to be. See, this is the idea that God is calling us to see, is that this idea of walking in His design of sexual integrity is something that frees us to become the person we were made to be rather than stifling any sort of expression of who we are. It's a lived expression of those words from the end of chapter 6 again, where Paul writes, "You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." One of the challenges that we face in the church is that for a long time, the way that we've talked about sex has made people think that this sort of struggle ends when you get married. So as long as you do your best before you get married, then whenever you get married, there's no more struggle for staying sexual or maintaining sexual integrity. We think this idea of like, so you burn with passion before and then you get married and then it's all just better. And we get really disappointed with God when that doesn't happen. See, this call to sexual integrity, this call to look at sex differently isn't just something for the singles in the room, it's for those of us who are married as well. To recognize that God's good design isn't just something we have to think about before we're married, but it's something He calls us to throughout our life. The call to sexual integrity is one that we are all called to maintain. It's a challenge for each of us. But a second challenge that I want us to think about whenever it comes to what it looks like to live faithfully as a single in this world is the challenge of loneliness. We're living at a time where in our world, loneliness is being described as an epidemic. And what makes the idea of remaining single seem a little bit cruel, right? If there's an epidemic going on around us and we're saying, well, singleness is a good gift, then we're kind of cruel to others. But I want to suggest that maybe the better solution to this epidemic of loneliness in our culture isn't necessarily running to marriage or pushing other people to marriage, but it is the church actually functioning as the community that God made us to be. What if the solution isn't marriage right now, but the church functioning like the family that God called us to be together? One of the things I love doing is looking throughout the Gospels and throughout the rest of the New Testament at Jesus living as a single and seeing the deep, intimate relationships he had with those in his circle. You can also look at the Apostle Paul, who had those new family, deep relationships that shaped and formed his life as well. If you read throughout Paul's letters, you'll see him use language like brothers or sisters. You'll hear him talk about legitimate sons. You'll hear him talk about children, kinsmen. He uses this deep relational language because he experienced deep relational and spiritual intimacy with those who were around him as he ran after God's mission. That's something God invites us into as well. I talked to several people in our congregation this week who have talked about how they found this type of community within their small group as they were single or they were single again and trying to navigate what to do. As a church, we firmly believe that transformation happens best in community, and that oftentimes within groups is one of the best places for the idea of caring well for one another to take place. If you're here and you're married, you have a role to play in this as well. Think about what it looks like for the singles in your life to be invited into your family life as well. Now, I want to say this up front. The singles in your life, whenever you've met one of them, you've met one single, okay? This isn't like every single person's the exact same, so here's the magic formula to engage every single in your life well. No, every person's different, so you need to listen well to what they enjoy, but here are just some things maybe you can consider. If you have a consistent meal time that you and your family eat together, what does it look like to keep a spot at your table open for someone in your life who may be single, to invite them into your family's story and in your family's rhythm? Not as an outsider looking in, but as someone who is part of that inner circle. See, this was God's design for the church family, and it's something that we can do together. Someone pointed out to me this week that a lot of the celebrations that take place whenever you enter adulthood center around marriage or having kids. And they suggested, what if you actually take intentional time to celebrate the significant moments that are happening in a single's life, like things like a job promotion or buying a house or moving or a change in a job, whatever it may be. Take time to celebrate that with them, to focus on that with them. But as you think about what this looks like, I want to encourage you not just to think about how it is that this person would fit into your family rhythms, but ask the question how you can intentionally create space to engage with them on their own turf as well. How can you take them out to dinner, maybe on a regular basis, to check in with them, to make sure that they are in a good place, to love them well? Invite them in to engage in things like your kids' sports or band stuff if you've listened well and you think they'll enjoy that. Not everyone wants to see your 7-year-old play soccer, okay? Say that as a kid or a person who coached 7-year-old soccer this year. I survived. Anyways, it's not something that's necessarily for everyone there, but invite them into your life and also allow them to, invite yourself into their world as much as they let you. I'll say this right here. You cannot control or make this happen, but what you can do is you can create space for these types of relationships to be fostered in your own life. A third and final challenge I just want to talk about is the challenge of unfulfilled hopes. You see, there's a very real challenge in dealing with the deep desires for a spouse, for family, to be moms and dads. These are good, God-given desires. They're desires that honor God. And I want to just encourage you as you wrestle through unmet desires for you to be really honest with God about that. I love Psalm 73, that passage we looked at earlier in the service. And I just want to even reiterate this idea that if you are in a place where you have unfulfilled desires and you're struggling with that, God can handle that honesty. I think that Asaph's words there in verse 13 may be something you can honestly say to God. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and have washed my hands in innocence. You see, God can handle that level of honesty with whatever it is you're wrestling through. If you feel alone and you feel like it's not fair, God can handle you saying that to him. He doesn't expect you to just sort of clean it up and have these beautiful prayers to him. He can handle the mess that you're feeling going on in your own heart. Work that out in prayer. And if you're looking for a script, take some of the Psalms and just pray through them. Be honest with the Lord about what you're feeling and experiencing and allow him to come alongside you in bringing some healing. It may just be that as you wrestle through this, you do get to that point where you're saying, who am I in heaven but you? And earth has nothing I desire beside you. But you don't have to start there. So be honest with God about those God-given desires. The second thing I would encourage you with is to find some trusted people around you to dialogue about those desires with as well. That's probably not like the 500 closest friends you have or the 70 closest friends you have, maybe not even the 12 closest. It may be like 1 to 3 close friends that you're really honest about these challenges with, who are gonna walk alongside you with godly counsel to point you towards God and God's heart for you. As you wrestle through this, one thing I've found in my own life when going through hard times is that oftentimes the why and when questions are really hard to answer. What I mean by that is asking God the question of, why is this happening? Or when is this going to change? Sometimes you don't get the answers you're looking for, but the thing that I've found most hope in is redirecting that to the who question, getting to know God's heart and God's character, pressing into God's character and saying, okay, I know I'm feeling this, and I know that God is a good father. So I'm choosing to trust God's character even whenever my experience doesn't seem to align with what I'm seeing, and what I'm seeing in my life doesn't seem to align with that. I thought a powerful picture of this were these words from Paige Benton Brown, who wrote an article entitled Singled Out by God, where she talked about some of the challenges of the messages she would receive from the church about singleness and what it looked like to be single, why she was single, and all of that. Here's where she sort of concluded in this article. She said, I am not single because I am too spiritually unstable to possibly deserve a husband, nor because I am too spiritually mature to possibly need one. I am single because God is so abundantly good to me, because this is his best for me. She talked about how that didn't change the fact that each day she prayed for a spouse. Each day she prayed for a husband. That was okay. But as she pressed in, she came to know God's heart and God's character in greater and greater ways. So as we wrap things up, I simply want to speak to those of you who are in this room who find yourself in a place where you're single and maybe it's not your desire. I want you to know that God sees you, that God honors your faithfulness, that God still has a deep role for you in his mission. He still desires you. You're just as much a part of God's family as anybody else. He desires you to grow in your intimacy with him in this challenging season. Continue to walk with him. And if you're here today and maybe you find yourself single because you lost a spouse, I want you to know that in a very real way, you lost part of you, but God still sees you. He loves you. In fact, in this time of loss, he desires you to experience deeper intimacy with him in a very real and unique way. There's no easy answers about what the future looks like, but I want to encourage you to press into him and to press into the community around you. The same thing is true if you're here today and you're divorced for whatever reason. There are a lot of complex reasons that lead to divorce. I'm not acting like this is really simple, but I want you to know that God sees you, he knows you, and he desires you to know him in greater ways. God has a role for you in his mission. He hasn't pushed you outside, and instead, in this season, he wants to draw you near. And as a church, I just want to challenge us to think about what it looks like to be this new family God's created us to be. A space where the feeling of loss, the feeling of grief, the feeling of disappointment isn't something that people have to hide. The fact that people maybe don't feel like they have to hide from a conversation with you because they don't want you to ask an awkward question. But that this would be a safe place for people to faithfully seek the Lord, to walk in relationship with him. I'm going to say that for the times we failed as a church, I'm sorry. We want to do better. We want to create a type of community, and we invite you to help us get there where people are loved and cared for well. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for being a faithful God who walks with us, who cares for us. God, I thank you for being a God who sees us where we are, who doesn't say you need to change your life circumstances in order to be on better standing with me, but instead sees us, loves us, and cares for us where we are. Thank you so much for Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.